Good evening. My name is Jack Leonard, and I would like to welcome you to the 8th in the lecture series associated with our spring semester Master of Landscape Architecture Interdisciplinary Studio 100-Year Coastal Resilience Studio, Hampton, Virginia. I hope that you enjoyed our last guest lecture in the series, Jana Vandergoot, who presented Resilience and Design Process, Studio Case Studies from Salisbury, Maryland and Ellicott City, Maryland. If you missed Jana's lecture, or any future lectures, you can watch them on the School of Architecture and Planning YouTube channel. Our guest lecturer this evening is Nathan Heavers. This evening, his topic will be Temperate Coastal Planting Strategies for Landscapes in Flux. Nathan Heavers is Associate Professor in the Virginia Tech School of Architecture and Design, teaching courses in field ecology and site engineering. His urban forestry expertise focuses on mid-Atlantic temperate broadleaf and mixed forests. Former horticulture manager at Washington's National Cathedral, lead gardener at New York's Cloisters Museum, and designer of Virginia Tech's Prince Street Urban Teaching Arboretum. Nathan received a Master of Landscape Architecture and an AB in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. Please welcome Nathan Heavers.
Good evening, everyone. Nice to be here today. Thank you for the invitation to speak. I am excited to talk with you about coastal plantings and coastal ecosystems, which I think many of you are now working on in your studios. Coastal vegetation, it plays an important environmental role. As you probably know, it's also important to the experience of the shoreline. So I'm going to talk about both of those ideas today. And we are going to look at the East Coast as our study area for this presentation. It sounds like we're going to hold questions to the end, but please enter your questions as they come up in the chat so you can remember those and we can look at them when the presentation comes to a close. There'll be plenty of time for conversation at the end. Just getting my technology to work here. I think I might be in charge of continuing to admit people as well. So I've been I've been fortunate to travel up and down the East Coast from Maine to Florida, but most of my time has been spent in the Mid-Atlantic, from about Rhode Island to Virginia. So this is going to be our large study area for this evening. And it's a good place to look at because it encompasses the rocky coast, the rocky regions to the north, and then the barrier beaches and bays to the south. This Mid-Atlantic combines a lot of what the whole East Coast has to offer. So it's a kind of microcosm of the larger region. Now, farther north, you get these glaciated coastlines, rocks, and then little bays between, and places carved by glaciers and sand moved by glaciers. And then farther south, down the region that you're working in and more familiar with, you get the large barrier beaches, washing out material washed off the coastal plain and then sorted by the ocean. Kind of like the barrier beaches down off the Chesapeake, where your studio is. So the question is, why is coastal vegetation important? Why is it important to discuss now? Well, you probably already know that it makes coastlines more resilient, meaning that it helps the coast weather storms and the extremes of climate. It also helps weather the slower, less perceptible changes that we're now experiencing. And many plants are adapted, the coastal plants are adapted to survive in the conditions that the coasts bring, which are actually kind of at the extremes. Sometimes it's flooded, other times it's like a drought condition, depending on the weather patterns we're getting. And plants have evolved over millions of years to survive under these types of conditions, actually thrive under these conditions. So why is it important to discuss these topics now? Well, you know, the climate's changing, and with it the shorelines and the ability of plants to live in these kind of environments. And we've also reconfigured the shorelines. So we have essentially made them habitable for us and for our purposes, at times completely removing the plants. So we, you know, the wonderful Inner Harbor here in Baltimore, near where you are, it's almost completely devoid of plants. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that we have different purposes for different parts of that long, thousands of miles of coastline. So I'm going to try and talk about some of the diversity of situations that you might find yourself working in along this thousands of miles of coastline. And hopefully then this will help you think about the problem that you have in Hampton Roads that you're working on for your studio. So the big issues, big storms, you know, inevitable sea level rise and warming are the topics. You know, we've put some parts of the coastline to good use, right? We love the shore, we love it to death, and we wouldn't have it any other way, really. But we should be thinking about what's going to become of some of the miles and miles of edges and strategies and ways that we can, in terms of this presentation, use plants to help deal with some of the issues that we now face. So these include, you know, the very drastic kind of scenarios of erosion from storms. Here's a site after Hurricane Irma 2019 down in Florida. And you know, the other sorts of situations which you're probably getting familiar with, like these ghost forests, which now line lots of inland waterways, inland coastal areas where saltwater intrusion is creeping into environments and wiping out, or not wiping out is probably the wrong way to say it, just altering ecosystems, making them so salty that trees can't grow in these environments. So I'm not going to go into all of these topics in detail. I just wanted to sort of present the lay of the land, as it will, in terms of the issues that are out there with coastal vegetation, and look at some particular sites to try and think about what we might do about these issues. So the sort of framework for the presentation is to talk about the structure function of ecosystems along the coast, but then also talk a bit about the experience that these places can provide, and then some strategies that consider a few strategies that might be useful to you in thinking about how we design in these types of environments. So we are stuck at home, right? All inside online. Usually I'd like to take students out in the field and look at places in live. These are a couple of students maybe a few years ago out on the barrier beaches in New Jersey. So that's sort of my forte, is actually being out in the field. It feels a little weird to talk about these kind of places through the screen. But what I want to try my best to sort of take you to the beach today and get out and see some beautiful landscapes. So we're going to start by thinking about how people in landscape architecture have been thinking about the question of how to design with nature for over 50 years. And specifically for coastal landscapes, we've been looking at ecosystems and trying to better understand how they what their structure and function is. And the idea behind this is that made by Ian McHarg and others, is that if we can understand how certain natural ecosystems work, then that can be a good model for how we might design ecosystems ourselves. And I think this argument still holds. There have been people who've challenged it in various ways, and with good reason. You should be aware of this book. One of your professors, Laurel McSherry, I think, did the cover. Beautiful cover. So there have been people who have criticized Ian McHarg's approach of which was basically to try and conserve natural systems, not so much thinking about how to design them. And there are good reasons to sort of criticize his approach a bit too, because we now face kind of novel and unprecedented circumstances along the coasts because of climate change. There's sort of a new normal there, and it's hard to say that the strategy should be to try and recover and restore systems that have essentially been erased or changing so rapidly that it's hard to imagine resetting them to some past condition. But I'm going to argue today that whether or not we're trying to recover a natural condition or not, I think it's a good rule of thumb to think about those systems that do exist and study those for insight into how we might move forward with coastal plantings. So McHarg's ideas, they carry right up to the present with designers like Kate Orff, Scape Landscape Architecture, probably familiar with her oyster texture project, and the work that she's doing on Staten Island to introduce oyster reefs to attenuate flows along the coast there. So the McHarg's ideas actually come through in this, and that their landscape architects now are still using natural systems as models for how we might design. And the context just may be different, and the way that the approaches may be different. The big term here is this idea of a living shoreline, that we should be thinking about not making inert walls and systems that eventually will break, but actually using what are called nature-based strategies to reshape our coastlines. So McHarg, advocated for conservation, trying not to develop certain areas. Now we're thinking more in terms of adaptive management for coastlines, assisted migration, moving species from one area to another as climate and conditions change, and this idea of nature-based designs, which for the coast basically means living shorelines. These are some of the main sort of principles that you want to work with for developing coastal plantings. Of course, you're going to want to conserve biodiversity. It's important to try and attenuate water flows. That just means slow water down. Plants are really good at that. Reduce erosion, which plants will do with their root systems. Even build land using plants. Filter water, which they can do in terms of sort of the rough texture of plants, and also absorb nutrients, picking up excess nitrogen coming off the land, as well as sequester carbon. So depending on the context you're working in, you could be trying to add these functions to a landscape, or conserve them. Just depends on the situation. So I've broken down the bulk of the presentation into these three categories here. I'm just calling them the front line, from the Rocky Coast to the barrier beaches, the back bay, which are estuaries and saltwater marshes. I think this is roughly the context you're working in for your studio, and inland waterways or freshwater marshes and floodplains. And we're going to talk about the structure of each of these a bit, and the experience that some of the plants that grow in them provide for us. And then I'll close the whole thing with some examples of design plantings. We're not going to go into a whole bunch of detail. You're not going to get like plant lists to work on today. That's the kind of stuff that we can work on. I'd be happy to work with you and share with you at a later date as your studio projects develop, and if you come back to me with questions. So we'll look first at this front line. You know, these are the areas that get hammered by storms. Here's Ocean City, Maryland, not far from probably where you are right now. And look at all that infrastructure down there. I think you can see my cursor, right? This is pumping sand onto the beach to replenish it, because the storms keep tearing away at the beach. And you know, just one of the main coastal issues that we're currently facing. Barrier beaches, that sort of front line, they've been experiencing storms, you know, before there were people inhabiting these landscapes. But just when McHarg was looking at landscapes as ecosystems, one of his first projects with students was to look at the barrier beaches in New Jersey. And that same year in March, a big nor'easter hit in '62 and blew out the barrier islands. It was a huge disaster. But so some of this stuff is nothing new. 50 years later, same location, Hurricane Sandy, tragically hits again. Sometimes hard to look at, right? So why is this sort of thing happening? Well, one reason is the way the development patterns have occurred in these areas. So there's a great case study. This is the same case study Ian McHarg used in Design with Nature. And that is, there's this area. It's now Island Beach State Park. It's in New Jersey on the barrier island of Long Beach Island. And it's about a 10, 12 mile stretch where a developer bought it just before the Great Depression and was planning on you know, creating just what we saw on other parts of Long Beach Island or the condition like Ocean City, Maryland. But the Depression hit and it stalled. And then later people rallied and made a park there. So there's an intact section of Barrier Beach that runs for a dozen or so miles, which you can visit just off the coast of New Jersey. You know, similar to lots of the barrier beaches south in Virginia down into North Carolina that you may have traveled to. The general condition here is that the winds and water don't hit this strip of sand parallel to it or perpendicular to it. They actually come from the north and east, and they carry sand and water toward the south and west. This process is called longshore drift. So the sand is constantly moving south along these beaches, eroding up on the north ends of the islands and depositing on the south. It works out okay at Long Beach Island because there's no real interruption along this stretch. But as soon as people start to put devices, like here you can see the groins in the water to catch sand to make their beach nice, well, then it takes away from the people south in this particular condition. It really depends on what way the current's going, who gets the sand and who doesn't. And that's why then we've got to get into, millions of dollars or more of beach replenishment each year in these situations. So, but under the condition where people haven't disturbed the dune ecology, which is this amazing system that is quite resilient in the face of storm surges. The island keeps going on with its natural processes. So one of the reasons why these dunes work so well is because they have a marram grass or a dune grass that grows on them, has these extensive root systems which go deep, deep into the sand. So they can withstand really dry conditions. It's almost like a desert in summer, and they can withstand salt and water and wind. And the grass holds the sand in place up at the surface. And you get this wonderful, wonderful system that might be a model for the ways that we might design with plants in the future. So I'm not saying necessarily recreate these, but there are some principles behind the dune system which are quite valuable. So here's an over 50-year-old section of this dune system that still exists at Island Beach State Park and other places up and down the East Coast. And it consists of this kind of primary dune, a secondary dune, and a back dune. And each one has a role to play. The primary dune on the left takes the brunt of the waves. It basically deflates them. It takes all the energy out of them when a storm hits. It's held together by the dune grass, which has a low profile. It diverts the wind, so when the wind hits it, it lifts it upwards, which protects everything that's behind. And there's this kind of it's like a standing wave of sand that's created with these multiple dunes, which sort of dampen off as you get closer to the back bay. There are little pockets of fresh water. You can see where my cursor is that build up in the troughs between the dunes. And the dunes protect the inland areas from excessive salt spray. So the amount of salt that's on the back side of the dune is less than the amount that's on the left side in the image or the ocean side. So there's this marvelous system that has been working along our coasts for eons that I think we should pay attention to. I want to open up that 50-year-old book and take a look at it. It's the second chapter, Sea and Survival. I'll walk you through the dune a bit. Here's the marram or the dune grass, the front line. You get over the top of the primary dune and into this kind of heather, real low plant that scrambles along the sand. Believe it or not, there's poison ivy is one of the main plants of these dunes. It's got extensive root systems that hold together and catch the sand, and it loses its leaves in the winter, so it can take the tough salt spray of the winter storms. And one of the just amazing gems of the dunes are the beach plums, which, to my mind, they rival the flowering cherries in DC around the tidal basin. They're just absolutely incredible when they're in bloom. And then you get to the back bay, you get to situations which are probably familiar to you from your studio studies, similar conditions to along the Chesapeake. So I couldn't help myself, but I started talking about some of the sort of qualitative aspects of the plants that are in this environment. Um, Sort of the designer coming out in me. But what's interesting about McHarg's work and the study of the structure and function of these systems is that he doesn't really get too much into the experience that these places can create for people. And I think there's a bit of a loss there. It's amazing. You drive this island, you pull up, and you're in a sort of a scrub forest on sand with red cedar and some low pines and bayberry. And you'll walk a little path through some probably more bayberry and I know there's Virginia creeper crawling through here, and then through maybe one of the troughs, the little low areas between the dunes. So down in here, you can see this royal fern, which this is new growth, about a month after this time of year, and this only grows in the freshwater. So there's a little pocket of freshwater between those big dunes. Some places there's enough moisture and soil builds up that you might have red maples over top of you in the canopy. And you push a little further here, there's seaside goldenrod and Virginia creeper for sure, and beginning of those patches of poison ivy. And then you're pushing up to the back side of the primary dune. You see the vegetation is changing. It becomes almost exclusively the dune grass. And finally, the moment we've been waiting for, right? That clear, beautiful horizon. So in that sequence, you see the not only the structure of it, but just that wonderful experience that these places can provide for people. And different than, say, having your house sitting right on the shore, pulling up to the garage and there you are. So I kind of like the delay. I like the unfolding of this experience quite a lot. And then that unobstructed view of the horizon. So where I'm from, which is up on the rockier coasts, the old timers around there will still talk about the 1938 hurricane like it was yesterday. This is New Haven, Connecticut. This is just west. I'm from Rhode Island, and it was such a huge event that it actually changed quite a bit about the way people just manage and design the landscapes there. You can see this is Browning's Beach. So this is in Rhode Island after the 38 hurricane, and just the massive amount of sand that was moved in a place where the dune was actually structurally quite sound. No one had really altered it, except for a few clusters of houses. And there's an interesting little cluster of houses up here, up in the middle of the image. And it sort of set the course of the development patterns in part in this area. This house, I'm not certain exactly. They call them cottages, but it's a little absurd to call it a cottage. It's a pretty big house. It is, I think, one of those in that cluster right there, and that was remained. But after this big storm, I'm not sure exactly of the policy, but people did not build any more houses on the sand this close to the beach along this stretch of Rhode Island. So this is just the last remaining one, and people sort of debate about its future. I think it's an interesting relic and probably good for a story. But my sort of feeling about this is that these landscapes are wonderful as public spaces and held sort of in the public trust. Not that I would advocate sending anyone packing, because that's part of the American spirit and dream too. But it's interesting to think about how we will and continue to either develop or retreat from these types of landscapes. And if retreating is part of a strategy for making them more dune ecologies, especially more resilient. I'm going to leave my comments and opinions probably at that point right there. But I think it is a question on the table as the sea level rises, what we should be doing about the resources we have along the shore. Then just a few miles north in Rhode Island, you get this amazing rocky landscape, and it sort of alternates between the bedrock like this glaciated landscape and then these bays in between, about a mile of beach, then a stretch of rock. And there will be different issues associated with the rock as the sea level rises. There's no buffer there. You go from waves slamming the rock to waves slamming your house. The rocks were a great foundation while the ocean was far away. And then there are these areas behind salt ponds, freshwater ponds, depending on whether there's a channel between the ocean and these areas. And I love these places. I like to think about them. I think it's worth looking at them with you just for a moment to point out that it's a very different setting than where I think you're working in Hampton Roads. But one of the things I find interesting about these areas is they're not very old. So these ponds are in the 1,000, maybe 2,000-year-olds. I mean, it sounds old, but they haven't been around that long because this whole area was reworked by the glacier. So the people will, one of my ecology professors once said that the middle of New Jersey was an Arctic tundra 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. So maybe we should keep that in perspective in terms of how we're thinking about these landscapes, and just recognize that they are in flux, and that, sad as it may be that we're getting ghost forests and these sorts of things, some really interesting ecologies might actually come out of it in the end. So I try to remain optimistic. A little farther north, this is Scituate, Massachusetts. There's this really, I visit here sometimes, there's this very interesting, call it a barrier beach that's been created by people. Essentially a pile of shingle or rounded stones that were laid in place to mimic a dune, but without the value of the vegetation on top. And it protects this little lagoon that's behind it. And so this is an interesting one because it's a sort of in between the kind of fixed hard levee scenario and the dune system, which can support plants and has perhaps some additional value because of that. Which brings us to our sort of middle chunk, which has to do with the inland, which has to do with the back bays, right? Lagoons and tidal, fresh or salt marshes. I was fortunate to, as a kid, that my mom was a marine biologist, so she would take us down to this little place, Succotash, along the shore. And let's see where my cursor is. It's called the Narrows there. She'd take us down there with buckets to collect specimens she could bring to her biology classes. It was great. We'd go down there and you go under the bridge, and the water would be moving so fast because of the pull of the tide, just the invisible pull of the tide would be rushing water through here. And we get anemones and sea urchins and starfish and all the different kinds of algae. And one of the things that was so fascinating about this environment to me is how every single thing that that lived in that spot had adapted to hang on, that with their hold fast or however they had their design to be resilient in that way, to deal with the stress of moving water, which is one of the qualities that most of the coastal plants have, is that they have that ability to hang on, which is an important quality in these types of environments because of the stresses that the plants find themselves in. But yeah, my mom can't help collecting. She keeps going out and finding stuff, even though she doesn't have any students now. So the back bay, this is this area of the marshes and the lagoons that's still salty, close enough to the ocean to be salty, and has the incredible cord grasses, tall and smooth, and it has a very different structure than the dune landscape. If the dunes and the barrier beaches are there to take the brunt of the storms, this system is there to disperse water, to spread it out, low and flat, and all about their beautiful horizons. And the water is this low, flat landscape. It does something special to the water. It makes the water move slowly, giving all of the plants time to absorb the nutrients that are laden in the water, and sediments that are laden in the water. So you know these landscapes. You can see you know they're slow moving because you can see the sinuous forms of the waterways. They're just taking that path of least resistance over years and years, and draining the land. So now we're out of the northeast, and here we're down along a tributary of the York River. This is just a little bit north, I think, of where you are studying. See the mix of pines and oaks in the canopy around there. So there's a special sort of section to all of this. That allows for flooding. It actually thrives on flooding, and there's a depth to it. The roots lodge deep in the soil. They build up peat, which is fantastic because it actually makes land. The plants will create their own habitat. They'll raise the land, which makes them more resilient and able to take the inundations when they do happen. I'm sure you've seen all of this at some point or another, so I won't belabor it too much. But this, of course, extends into the bays with the eelgrass and all of that as well, which is all part of it. It's essentially a continuous system that is can provide all sorts of ecosystem services, which I assume is a term that Laurel, Professor McSherry has been telling me that you've been getting a lot of science in the presentations so far. So hopefully this one's not too heavy on the science, but hopefully you got the term ecosystem services in your toolkit at this point, and you're thinking in those terms. I'm trying to bridge the two, where you're thinking about what these can provide as environmentally, and you're also starting to shift your attention to the experience that you as a designer can create in these kinds of environments. Let's see, make sure I've got all of this. If you want a good, it's a fairly thin book, maybe a little hard to get your hands on, I think, but about these kinds of environments, I recommend looking at this John Stilgoe Shallow Water Dictionary. He wrote his boat essay along some like lesser traveled tidal streams and coves up in his area, Massachusetts. And you can get a sense through the language, especially, what these places are like. All the words, there's so many words that are associated with the coastal systems that, I only know a few. I'm sure there's a much deeper vocabulary here that I'd love to know. I heard Jack, Professor Leonard there said he comes from a family of skipjacks. Unfortunately, I was aware of what that was. But my guess is that you've got a good resource there in terms of the language of these landscapes. And in your professor, you should pay attention to that. So what's happening in the back bay? Why the ghost forests and all of that? Well, and I'm just calling it a back bay. Like, you could call it anything you want. There's probably about 50 words for what these different landscapes are. But there's this issue of the saltwater intrusion. And I can't stand these diagrams that you find online, but I used one and I altered it. And the reason I can't stand it is because it doesn't have anything to do with the actual topography that you find out on the salt marshes. This section here is like super steep. It got nothing to do with that long, low horizon. And the reason the saltwater intrusion is such an issue is because there is such a long, low horizon. And I drew this orange line to represent a truer section, is that saltwater intrusion can run very quickly, especially if you draw down the water table, can run horizontally long distances inland. And there's some places where, just in putting together this presentation, I've not been down here. I just started looking at this. Places where these ghost forests are reaching very, very far inland in the Albemarle-Pamlico Peninsula in North Carolina, where there were canals that were constructed for draining the areas or irrigation, and you raise the sea level a foot or something, and they're working in the opposite direction to bring salt water up in very, very far inland. So it is a huge issue, and these are issues that impact, not just million-dollar homes on the coast, but agricultural productivity in many areas, fisheries, all sorts of things. But there's something to be aware of, that this saltwater intrusion is not just about a thin little line. It can reach very deep into the interior. The same way, you've probably seen this, pulled the same diagram off of the internet, right? The same way the Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries act to bring salt water far inland. So there's a bit of brackishness to Washington, D.C. and its environs. You're down here, down the bottom, right? You're right off of just a little north of Norfolk there, so pretty high salinity. But if you go off any one of the tributaries in your area, you probably are getting into what I'm referring to as the inland waterways, or the freshwater tidal marshes and forest floodplains. This is the last example, so I'm trying to be conscious of time here. I need to roll along a little faster. But place that I've frequented quite a bit, not far from where I used to work in Alexandria with Professor McSherry. Just as a little aside, she would, I think, go park at the marina here and sit in her car and read. That's her mode of operating. I would go out and take a walk in the salt marsh. So those are two valuable experiences of ways to check out the marshes. One of the things about this marsh is you can see what people have done and the effects that it has on a place like this pretty prominently in this nice set of images. See this promontory on the left image? This was basically a gravel bank that was protecting the marsh from storm surges coming from south to north. We're on the Potomac River here. And that was quarried for gravel. And look what happens. Take the promontory out. This is the same performing the same effect as the dunes on the back bays, right? And it has been eating away at the marsh so that it's down to, I don't know, a quarter of its size or less. So these principles of making sure you preserve or design for the structure and function of the landscape come into play here. The freshwater marshes, they are a bit different in character. Of course, they have different plants because they don't have the same high salinities. But again, one of these sections where it's exaggerated, but it's actually stretched out along a long, thin line. And the place that you walk when you go to Dyke Marsh is basically at the seam between the low and the high marsh, but it's inches difference in elevation. But one of the things that is wonderful about the freshwater marsh is that, unlike the Spartina and the sort of low profile of the plants across the saltwater marshes, the freshwater marsh has this wild rice, which can grow 10, 12 feet. It's the big plumy thing here. And then the larger cattails, maybe 4, 6 feet. So you get the feeling of being in a thicket when you're crossing through these landscapes, which is also seasonal, because when all this vegetation dies down in the wintertime, you get that vast open space again. So it comes and goes through the season. So something to keep in mind as you're developing your designs is, what's the spatial configuration that the plants that you are working with in these wetland environments can provide. There's a little success story here. I think this is National Park Service land, and they have very recently begun to place a new promontory or breakwater of stone to extend where that old promontory was. And this is going to be great for the marsh. Now you say, okay, well, there are no plants here. What's this have to do with plants? Well, sometimes with plants, all you have to do is place some structure, which is then going to be the harbor that is going to allow them to grow. So by placing stone to protect the marsh, then there's going to be an accumulation of sand and silt and sediment, and then the grounds for future plants that may just seed in or wash in from the marsh that's nearby. So that is a very big success. And these types of things are happening up and down the East Coast. The last type here is the floodplain forest. This is adjacent to the freshwater marsh. It houses sycamore and sweet gum and what else is down there? A host of species. Red maple for sure in this environment. So often willow oak grow here, and sometimes yellow buckeye. So quite a mixture. These are the sorts of things you sort of need to know the type, landscape type, and then you can go to lists that will help you devise planting plans that are suitable for your particular area. So I've tried to give you a sense of some of these environments. I'm trying to encourage you to think about going out into the field and looking at some of these places, because there's a huge amount of variety, even just within the Chesapeake Bay, much less the whole East Coast. You're going to find that you're going to need to become a local expert in vegetation, no matter where you go. The broader area of research, you've probably seen this term of what I'm talking about, is coastal zone management, CMZs. You should look at what the NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, is doing in terms of coastal zone management programs. These are organized by states. You can check those out. In my searching, I've been very impressed by North Carolina Coastal Federation. This is similar to, say, Virginia Coastal or other organizations, but they have a great organization, nonprofit, that has basically been working on living shoreline projects for over 30 years. So there's some good baseline data on planting in these. One of them is this pine knolls. which is also in that Albemarle-Pamlico Sound. And you can see how just the tiniest little bit of a breakwater can function to help secure and protect the plantings of the cordgrass that they have here. So I've got to wrap this up pretty soon. Hopefully you've heard of Poplar Island. Are you familiar with this one, right? So on the other end of the spectrum, there's the recreation of sinking islands, right? And I don't know what to say about this one, except that you should be thinking about how you don't necessarily need to plant everything, that you really often you're trying to set up the conditions so that something will then grow. You can sort of see in here, I haven't used my annotation at all. I'll just use the cursor, right? You can see the band of actually what was planted. And then you can guess that some of those other areas were left and not, and plants will seed in. You should check out this paper that I wrote about, so most people will say, you should read my book. Well, this one's for free. So you can check out this paper here. And it's about McHarg's legacy in Washington, D.C. And it sort of describes how his larger scale planning ideas have actually been carried out as more boutique, smaller projects, like these rain gardens in Georgetown Waterfront Park, which are quite resilient. They're going to take all the water off the park. And if it floods, which it sometimes does in this area, could get to 14, 15 feet, they're going to be able to withstand the flooding of the Potomac. And there are other examples in there. You know, on the southeast waterfront, this is now sort of par for the course, where you have switchgrass. You know, it's not the greatest coastal plant, but it can survive any conditions. River birch. People are developing a palette that actually works pretty well in these situations. So when the Anacostia, which is here on the right, floods, we have plants that are resilient. And then all the rest of the year, when water is running off the urban environment, it's filtered by these types of plantings. And the last stuff that I've been working on, you might just find this interesting, and then I'll wrap this up, is I've been on the advisory committee for the Tidal Basin Ideas Lab, which you should check out. And it's all about the tidal basin here. This is a constructed landscape built beginning in the 1880s and in the path of the Potomac River. And it is subsiding, just like the area that you're working on in Hampton Roads. And so this Ideas Lab brought together, oh, here it is, you know, this is from the 40s. This place has been dealing with the same issues. We've all been dealing with the same issues. We just tend to forget that these storm surges have been a recurring theme. And I got a little out of sequence here, but you can't help but love the bald cypress down at the end of Haynes Point here in DC. And that Laurel, I see you're there. This is Michael. That's for you. on the knobby knees of the bald cypress. So there have been some really good decisions actually to plant the bald cypress down here in the wettest spot. If all you did was plant bald cypress, you'd be good with your projects, I think, for the studio. As long as the salt's not too great. This is actually really only good for the brackish or fresher waters. But down in the tidal basin, check these things out. There are 5 firms that were asked to participate in this. And the great thing about it is that every single one of the firms, there were five leading firms in the US, they all thought about marsh and floodplain forest conditions for the tidal basin. So 50 years after these were just like cutting edge ideas, well, they're still unfortunately kind of cutting edge ideas, but everybody's participating in this conversation. So there's GGN's proposal. You see the boardwalks on the marshes, and they're very schematic. Here's Susanna Drake opening up the whole thing to the river, and Hood Design. he developed this idea of 4 novellas, and one of them was about the Hush Harbor, the one down the bottom corner. These kinds of environments, the marshes and the lowlands and the swamps were places where enslaved people, African Americans, got away. So he wants to think about the tidal basin as a place that, not that place specifically, but can tell the story of the African American experience, which I thought was a great one. And a little more conventional on the Reed Hildebrand. Good project though, so I appreciate that one a lot. And especially its emphasis on walking, which I've tried to emphasize a bit today. And one of 3 schemes that field operations presented, this one having to do with the idea of just letting the water rise and not really trying to design everything. So a bit controversial, but I've tried to be that a little bit today with, thinking about how we might need to give up some ground here, and leave some room for the water and the plants. So I should stop. Sorry, that was a bit longer than I expected, but I kind of went off script, and that's what happens. I welcome any of your questions, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful lecture. So everybody, you're able to unmute yourselves if you want to and go ahead and ask your questions, or as always, you can type it in the chat if you'd like, and I'll ask it for you.
Hi, thank you so much for your time. This was really interesting, and I love all the science that we're getting.
That's good.
I'm curious with saltwater intrusion. So our site, the surface waters are really high salinity, and the area that I'm interested in working is more inland. So it'd be like behind a inland bay type of, habitat. And I'm curious with saltwater intrusion, if I do any kind of bioretention areas that are maybe connected to the bay, how much, I have to worry about the salinity of that water mixing with maybe like fresh water coming from stormwater. The reason I'm thinking about this is because of the image you showed with the ferns growing behind the dunes, in that,
Yes.
water pocket. That just surprised me, because I would have thought, it's right on the ocean, so I would think it would have saltwater intrusion, but I guess those that's been like that for a long time. And then you have the ghost forests that are far away from the ocean that are experiencing more saltwater intrusion. So I don't know my question, maybe just if you could explain a little bit more about how maybe how that saltwater intrusion can affect plantings. Like with the sensitive fern, do you think there's any chance of saltwater intrusion into that little freshwater pocket, or?
Yes, well, it's all a sectional question, right? The one thing that I know that I think is important to the question is that the freshwater sort of floats on top of the saltwater. They don't necessarily mix. So you have the saltwater is denser because it's got all the salt in there, right? And this happens in the bay too, right? When the rivers run in, the surface water can be fresher up at the top where the river runs, freshwater river running in, and the saltwater dives below it. So in the dune example, there is a little pocket, a little lens, it's called, of fresh water that is caught in the trough between those two dunes. And it's all from rainwater. There's no other way for it to get there. It just comes from the rain, and it sits up on top of salt water that's below. So in that example, McCarg was arguing we should stay off of those areas, and we should not make wells. Because if you pull the water out with a well, then what's going to replace it? Well, the salt water is going to come up from below. So there are all sorts of dynamics. I don't know as much as I would like about them, and I don't want to pretend that I do. My father was an oceanographer, and he would be annoyed at me if I ventured into territory which I was not an expert in. So I want to be cautious, but I think you should be looking at the section. You should think about how the fresh water will float above salt water to an extent, and that probably in these scenarios, inches and feet matter quite a bit. So if you have a drop from the land down to the place where you're trying to, say, filter or catch water from the land before it goes into your bay, well, then you may be able to harbor some freshwater liking plants if there's a drop. But as soon as you're running right along that water table and the level of the salt water, then you're at risk of saltwater intrusion. Is probably the most I should say. And there was some other thought that occurred to me. It was, it's that you've got to beware of two sources of salt. One is from the intrusion from the salt water lens below. Think of it as the saltwater aquifer, right? In the diagram I showed you, there's just a body of salt water. It's all saturated. But you also have to worry about the salt water that comes from a flood. So that it's like your surface flows and groundwater flows when you're studying hydrology, right? So you got two sources of it. Is something to think about. Those are good questions. Yeah, I might have to see the diagram of the proposal and then maybe get into more detail.
Thank you. That was really helpful. So,
yeah. Anybody else? Yeah, okay. Larissa says best place to go in Alexandria for Dyke Marsh, right?
Hi, Nate.
Hey, nice to see you or hear you. There you are. Cool.
Yeah, if anyone has a chance to go to the Dyke Marsh, Laurel and I both are huge fans.
Yeah.
It's amazing because it changes, every hour. It's truly incredible. And there are bald eagles there.
And you get the random otter.
And otters. Yeah.
Can't beat that.
And it looks like Sarah had a comment.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Hi, Sarah. Oh, right. Rhode Island and Connecticut. Yes, I'm glad that I brought you down a walk down memory lane. And yeah.
Not the most. But no, my father lives in Newport, Rhode Island, and I grew up on the Connecticut shoreline in the summers, and just the smells from high tide to low tide, and I will always love the smell of low tide, even though people hate it. And racing hermit crabs on the sandbars. You brought back a lot of just all those amazing elements of being so close to the water in that part of the world. So thank you.
Oh, that's great. I wasn't even thinking about the smell, but yeah, that's a huge factor. That's great.
Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, I had actually on a similar vein as Ellie's question. The area that I have been looking at in Hampton is expected to probably transition from a brackish marsh to a saltwater marsh over the next 80 to 90 years. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the changes one might expect to see in the plants that would be drawn to those conditions over time. Like what would potentially stay, what would leave, what would be able to hang on?
That's a great question. I wish I had those lists in my head of all those species. It's not exactly my wheelhouse of the transition between those two. But have you seen Tyner's book, Tiner? A great book on the salt, fresh, brackish marshes of the east. And you can look in there, I can type Tyner in there into the, in case you didn't get it. You can look in there and see what you'd expect to find in each of those environments. My understanding of it, and this comes a bit from looking at what some of the extension agents are doing in New Jersey right now. They're starting to grow plants that they think they're going to need to replace the plants in other areas. This is either for assisted migration, like they're trying to take sea oats from the south and introduce it into New Jersey as a replacement plant for some of the landscapes there. But my understanding of it is that the water regime may change, but you can probably use the plants that are in the salt marsh in what was once brackish, right? So they're basically, we're shifting what was brackish to salt, and there's just going to be a moving line. That may be too simplistic an idea, but I think it probably makes sense to some extent. So I'd be looking at, if you think it's going to become salt, it's brackish now, what's going to become salt, that you'd be looking at what the salt marsh contains as your replacement plants.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So a quick question along those lines. I was studying in our plant design class, I was studying plants that can grow with a range of PPT, like from 0.5 to like 33 to the ocean. Would you suggest like plants like that would survive more in the conditions that Maura just spoke about? Like,
oh, you mean
with a large
like
range?
You're going to get the ones with the greatest range?
Yes.
Well, that would be the safest, right?
Okay, gotcha.
I mean, I think that yeah, you're hedging there, and that's probably wise. But I probably didn't mention it enough. But you're also looking at, you're not only looking at salinity now, but you're looking at temperature is going to be changing a bit, and you're also looking at changing the water regimes somewhat, because if storms are larger, then you have to have probably the most aggressive root systems. Yeah, good questions.
Do we have any more questions?
Nathan, I was glad to see you're presenting those final tidal basin designs. Just from the student's perspective, to be able to see the fact that there are wide-ranging ideas that can be presented, and these were presented in somewhat conceptual form. I mean, these were not construction drawings. These were big ideas, some just accommodating the situation and what do we do as it happens versus let's try to fight it, and let's see what we can do in those situations. And just the graphics that went along with that, I think, are something the students could look at just to see a way to portray their ideas if they're thinking about something along the lines of one of those approaches. Oh,
good. Yeah, I'm glad you appreciate that. Yeah, it's just wonderful that we're thinking about the city as a place where these types of environments can thrive. For so long, it's just been a hard edge. And now we're starting to think about how to break that down and make it a habitat but also a place that people want to go. So it's, I don't know that we would get the same designs even 20 years ago. I don't think so. So I think that the sort of the ideas that are out there among the leading designers are more in line with nature-based strategies, though they would never say that, right? They're going to call them living shorelines or something, right? They're a cooler name. But that this work that people have been doing in landscape architecture for a long time is somehow all of a sudden becoming a bit more relevant because we face sea level rise and climate change. So I think it's both a little scary. We're not sure what to do exactly, but it's also a good thing.
Okay, next question.
You can also write into the chat if you want to.
I actually had another question, which is just thinking about that, the first few slides that you showed of, the last beach house on the Rhode Island shore after.
Yeah. I was playing a little bit. It's not so true. I just.
But yeah, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about, like how, so there's like the edge between water and land, and then there's also the edge between like human residential development and areas that we've decided are not for residential development and houses. And if you have any thoughts on design strategies that let people in to experience these places without compromising the structure that allows them to exist, the natural structures that allow them to exist and serve their protective functions.
Yeah, I didn't go into it enough, but if you were to look at, say, the Island Beach State Park example in New Jersey, you will see where they place the road, where they place the parking areas, and all of this. And it actually follows roughly what McCarg says in the Sea and Survival chapter. And that is in that particular section, it's along the back dune. So which sort of makes sense. In this, basically, that you want to preserve that primary and secondary dune, especially because that's what's going to take the brunt of the storms. But some of the parking areas sort of breach that and go into that space between the primary and the secondary. So that's a good one. So if you were to just go up in Google Earth and fly around and look at it, you would get a sense of what the layout of that particular area is. And it's following some of the principles. This one that we're looking at here, I didn't mention what it is. It's Napatree Point on what's called Little Narragansett Bay. It's in Rhode Island. Connecticut's on the other side that you can see right there in the image. And it's a long sort of spit of land that protects a nice bay up to the right here. But then, half a mile behind us is Taylor Swift's house, her like giant mansion. So we've got competing interests, right? But fortunately, those houses are up on the bluff, right? They're up quite high. And fortunately, this land was set aside. So this is another sort of success story for keeping the bay, that Little Narragansett Bay that's up in here, safe with this dune, which actually goes up to about 25, 30 feet. And in this case, I wish I could sort of flip the camera, get out of the standing view here and look above quickly. But this case, the parking area and everything is in the sort of inside elbow of this spit of land here. So the barrier dune is doing all its work on the ocean side, which is sort of to the up and to the left of the image here. And all the sort of development and the beach parking and all that kind of stuff is tucked in behind. So if there's any principle that I've sort of observed, it's that these structures, the human structures, are in the sort of lee side, tucked in behind some of the outer edges, which makes sense, right? It's sheltered and everything.
Do we have any more questions?
I wanted to make a comment if I could. This is Laurel. First of all, thank you, Nate. Welcome.
Hi, Laurel.
Hey. And thank you for the shout out to Dyke Marsh and Bellhaven Marina.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely true. Yes, I would sit in my car there, which illustrates there's a range of activities that people engage in the coastal zone.
Yeah.
Sometimes they are paddle boarding and sometimes they're walking and sometimes they're sitting in their car and just sort of thinking. And so, but what I wanted to say is I appreciate how you began your talk with the image of the East Coast, because the word coastal, what coastal actually means and looks like varies with scale. And I think the students are beginning to appreciate that. And for instance, when we think about the East Coast relative to the United States, we might think coast is a line, sort of a line separating what's dry and what's wet, right? The terrain and the ocean. When we think about maybe the state of Virginia, we might think, well, there's coastal counties, and those are different than inland counties. So that in fact is coastal. But when you get to the scale of Hampton, you get even more nuanced when you start to look at how within, I think it's 63 miles within Hampton, there's 63 miles of coastal edge, and how there is tremendous variation in what that means, or what coastal zone means along those 63 miles. So I appreciate that you started with that drawing or that map, but also that you continually, throughout your presentation, you talk about working sectionally and thinking about the landscape sectionally, as well as looking at it in plan. But you can't understand this landscape in plan because it's a dynamic landscape that's in flux and it's defined by changing water levels. So it's essential that the students think about this sectionally, and both thinking about it sectionally to understand its structure and how it functions, and then using that as the basis for how they would think about changing it. So I really appreciate the conversation about section.
Oh, good. Thank you. 63 miles. Wow. Yeah, for one township or something, or one.
Well, in 1975, it was 63. I mean, that's sort of, I don't know in 2021 how many miles, but it's 63 miles back in 50 years ago.
Yeah. Oh, it's so funny looking for an image of the East Coast, right? With putting together presentations like this, you're looking for things, you have an idea, and then it doesn't quite fit. But one of the things that surprised me was that you can find maps which express the East Coast as the states which touch the East Coast. And so, what gets left out? Well, the one that's surprising to me is Pennsylvania. A lot of people will interpret the East Coast as not including Pennsylvania, but yet we know that these rivers go up deeply into the interior, and so they are in one way or another on the coast. Yeah, lots of ways to interpret that. That's great comment.
Which means that Alice and Larissa right now may or may not be in the East Coast.
That's right. Yeah, the other one I like is Eastern Seaboard. That's my favorite.
Yep.
Because that goes all the way up to the mountains. Thank you.
A comment, maybe a question, with the idea of the dunes and these coastal ecosystems seem to be the most resilient and sustainable systems. But my question is, over time with sea level rise, they've been able to sustain kind of the events. They've been able to, respond from the hurricanes and things. But sea level rise is different. It's not going to come and go. It's going to come and it's going to come and it's going to keep coming. Do you see these systems being able to just evolve and continue to change and survive? And if so, can we use that? Because what we're really worried about in most cases, not the ecological survival and resilience. We're worried about the man-made survival and resilient sustainability. And, you know, how do we stop sea level rise? Can you build, you know, 12-foot high dune systems around the coast, which then is able to withstand sea level rise and protect these areas? But the water tends to be able to sneak around the back way, you know, so you can't really keep the water from coming in if it's coming out, you know. So I don't know what your thoughts are about these systems with the sea level rise issue and not the resilience based on the event issue.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I've sort of mulled it over, not having thought about it enough probably to give much of an answer. And, you know, I'm not a hydrologist exactly. But with the questions that I wonder about, again, comes back to the section, because I'm not certain about what's replenishing the sand for the barrier beaches, right? If that's being lifted from the seafloor along the continental shelf somewhere and it lifts it up to the dune, or if it's material that's coming off the rivers and being resorted. And so I'm not sure about the material sources, and also not sure about the rates, right? So there are rates of change that might make it so that the system would be resilient, and then there are probably other rates of change where it's just it's going to be a catastrophic failure, and then that's not that I just don't know. But I think that the plants probably help the dunes withstand those storms, right? They certainly help this withstand the storms, and also build material. They give a place for material to catch, and I think that's important. So all the sediment that comes downstream in any of our rivers is actually a good resource, right? That's what, when we look at the Mississippi, you know, another system, but what kept the Mississippi working is that the sediment was falling out on the flats the farther south it got. When we starved the landscape of sediment by building all the levees, that's when the land starts going down. So my guess is that in the environment that you're working in with the studio, that you want to encourage the water to slow down, sedimentation to happen wherever you can. And then maybe the sea is going to be interacting with all of that material. I just don't know. I wish I did, but those are great questions.
Well, it's almost 6:30. Do we have any last questions?
Thank you all. This was wonderful.
Thank you so
Enjoyed
much.
meeting you. I think I should be able to make it to your studio presentations maybe on the 17th. I'll set that as a goal.
Great, thanks. We appreciate it.
Great. Okay.
Great to see you.
Good to see you too. Have a great evening. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Jack, do we have another lecture coming up?
Yes, next week we have lecture, same time, by Alex Darr, one of the faculty members at Morgan. We'll be discussing and presenting stream and riparian corridor restoration in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So we look forward to people joining us again next week for another informative lecture on our